everybody. This is going to be the last lecture in our series on stem cuttings. Just going to start with a quick recap from earlier lectures on stem cuttings. So you've already learned that some plants have preformed root initials and produce adventitious roots easily from stem cuttings. Plants that don't have preformed root initials produce what we call de novo adventitious roots in response to the wounding process that occurs when we take the cutting. In both these cases, the plants produce endogenous auxins in response to the wounding. Those auxins move in a basipital direction in the plant and accumulate at the base of the stem cutting. As propagators, we can also promote adventitious root formation and increase rooting uniformity by applying synthetic auxins exogenously, either to the base of a stem cutting or as a foliar application after the cuttings have been stuck. We can also promote adventitious root formation by making sure we take our cutting material from mother plants that are free of any obvious pests and diseases and aren't drought or nutrient stressed in any way. Some plants, though, don't produce adventitious roots, even after we seemingly take all the right steps, or maybe they don't root in numbers that are commercially acceptable. Maybe one day we'll have a better understanding of the genetic pathways involved in adventitious root formation, and we'll be able to manipulate the genetic triggers. In the meantime, though, for these harder to root plants, there are other techniques we can use and other factors that we can consider, and that's what we're going to focus on in this lecture. By the end of this unit, you'll be able to describe modified techniques for preparing stem cuttings of woody, harder to root species, and describe how seasonality and juvenility might affect the production of harder to root species. Additional factors we can consider for harder to root woody species include juvenility, seasonality, and photoperiod. We can also modify the techniques that we've learned to prepare stem cuttings from woody plants. These modified techniques include additional wounding and including a section of older wood at the base of the cutting. There's still so much that we don't know about plant physiology, including the production of adventitious roots. The modified techniques and additional factors to consider that are mentioned in this lecture are based on empirical evidence, which is observation and experimentation, or in its simplest form, trial and error. Sometimes you'll need to try a combination of these techniques. My goal in describing some of these techniques to you is to give you additional methods to consider trying when you're not having success with some of the woody stem cuttings you may be working with. You may well have to set up your own trials using a combination of methods and various strengths of rooting compound. And so that you're not starting from scratch, good places to search for existing information are in Google Scholar, not just Google, try Google Scholar, and if you're a member, the Journal of the International Society for Horticultural Science or the International Plant Propagators Society. So let's take a closer look at some of these methods now. One technique we can use with some harder to root woody species is additional wounding at the base of the stem. You saw this used by the propagator at Burncoos Nurseries in the video field trip when she was demonstrating the preparation of semi-hardwood stem cuttings of Camellia, Rhododendron, and Lomatia. There are several different wounding techniques. On species with narrow leaves, such as junipers and thuya, and a lot of the other conifers, stripping off the basal leaves by hand very quickly so that some of the bark is removed at the same time can be a quick and very effective method of wounding. Another technique is to slice off a very thin sliver of wood at the base of the stem, either on one side or on both sides. The cut shouldn't be deep. It should just be slicing away the epidermis and a little bit of the cortex. You're not cutting into the vascular tissue or the pith. In the photo here, you can see a demonstration of how I've removed a very fine strip of the epidermis from the side of this olive stem. The cut should be deep enough to remove the epidermis and some of the cortex underneath, but not so deep that you're cutting into the pith. In the photo, you can see that I've cut deeper towards the base of the stem and have actually cut into the pith at the center. And you can see that by these changes in the color, with the epidermis or the bark on the outside here, and then this strip of green just underneath the epidermis is the cortex, and just on the edge of that you've got the vascular bundles, and then the pith is this pale colored area, this core going right up the middle. So it's quite an art trying to keep your blade shallow enough so that you're just cutting through to the cortex and the cambium. And it's really good to practice first on wood that's not needed for cuttings. Another technique is to split the stem base by making a vertical cut upwards through the base of the stem, about 1/2 inch to 2 inches long, depending on the species and the size of the cutting. A very slim blade, such as a scalpel or a box cutter, is often better than the thicker blade of a pocket knife or a grafting knife, because they can sometimes cause the stem to split. In the photo on the right here, the stem that I've demonstrated this on is an olive. It's the Frantoio cultivar, and I just want you to note that olive doesn't actually need this treatment. I was just using it here as a demonstration. So why do these wounding techniques work? Well, we really don't know exactly why, but it's believed that the wounding techniques increase the surface area through which exogenous auxins can be absorbed. There's also a mechanical separation of the layer of sclerenchyma tissues that are present in some species that can act as a physical barrier to the emergence of the adventitious roots through the epidermis. Some species benefit from having a small section of older wood at the base of the stem, and there are 2 ways in which we can achieve this: heel cuttings and mallet cuttings. Heel cuttings are taken from side shoots that are torn away from the main stem in such a way that pulls away a sliver of the epidermis and cortex of the main stem with it. And again, you saw this being demonstrated by the propagator at Burnkoos Nurseries in the video field trip. That heel that's pulled away from the main stem should be trimmed back with a sharp knife or clippers so that there's a nice clean straight edge, and then the cuttings are ready to stick. Mallet cuttings are also taken from side shoots and have a hammerhead-shaped section of the older stem at the base, as shown in the photo on the right here. This can also be a useful technique with leaf bud cuttings, which we'll talk about in the next module. All plants grown from seed exhibit a juvenile and a mature phase. In the juvenile phase, a plant is physiologically incapable of flowering. After transitioning to the mature phase, it can produce flowers and therefore fruit and seed. The juvenile period can be really short in annuals, which germinate, emerge, put on vegetative growth, then bloom, go to seed and die all in one growing season. Some herbaceous perennials may have a juvenile period of just 2 years, and some bulb species may have a juvenile period lasting several years when they're grown from seed. And these are all good things to know when you're growing plants from seed, because you may wonder why they're not blooming in the first couple of years after the plants have established. In woody species, the juvenile period may be even longer, depending on the species. For example, pear seedlings have a juvenile period of between 12 and 18 years. Apples have a juvenile period of between 5 and 12 years, and olive seedlings round about 12 years. If you're a commercial fruit grower or a cut flower grower or a specialist bulb nursery, it's not economically viable to wait this long for your plants to produce fruit or flowers. One way around juvenility is to take stem cuttings from plants that aren't juvenile. We can then bypass the period of juvenility because the cuttings inherit the mature characteristics of the wood they're taken from. This is one of the advantages of growing plants from stem cuttings as opposed to seed that was mentioned in an earlier unit. To digress a little bit, in some species we also see juvenility being expressed in other physical characteristics, such as the foliage. A good example of that is the plant that's shown in the photos here, the silver dollar tree, or Eucalyptus cinerea. And horticulturalists and florists have taken advantage of this differently shaped foliage in the juvenile period of this tree. And you've probably seen stems of this plant in the florist or in the floral section at the supermarket, or if you live down south of Watsonville or near Aromas, then you may well have seen fields of silver dollar tree. The familiar palmate leaves of Hedra helix, English ivy, only occur in the plant's juvenile phase. And in the mature phase of this plant, the leaves aren't palmate at all and look quite different to the much more ornamental juvenile leaves. Whitethorn acacia is native to Mexico and Texas and is a popular small tree in ornamental landscapes in Arizona. This tree doesn't have differently shaped foliage in its juvenile and mature phases, but its juvenile stems have evil white thorns, which are an adaptation to prevent grazing of young plants by animals such as deer. In the mature phase, the stems don't have these thorns. So as plants age, juvenility is lost and plants are able to flower, produce fruit and seed. And you may be wondering what this has got to do with propagation. What it has to do with propagation is that the loss of juvenility can have an adverse effect on adventitious root formation in cuttings. Once some plants enter their mature phase, there may be a lower percentage of cuttings that root and a reduction in the length and number of roots that are formed. This is bad news for us as propagators. The reason for the loss of adventitious root formation with increasing age isn't known, but it's thought to be a loss of the ability of maturing tissue to respond to auxins. So, what as propagators can we do to overcome the problems of the loss of juvenility? One way to bypass the problems caused by the loss of juvenility is to use grafting techniques instead of stem cuttings, and we'll talk about grafting in week 16. Another method we can try is also to use a higher concentration of exogenous auxins, probably at least 16,000 parts per million of IBA or even higher. We can also take cutting material from the cone of juvenility. The cone of juvenility is illustrated in the diagram on the right, which shows a stylized tree with regions both above and below ground that contain the most juvenile tissues. So both roots and shoots can be included in the cone of juvenility. The juvenile tissues are the ones nearest to the crown, and they include wood that is still physiologically juvenile but chronologically old. The rooting potential is greatest from wood or roots that are in the cone of juvenility. So if we're having problems rooting our stem cuttings or root cuttings, they may root better if we try to collect our cutting material from stems that are coming from within the cone of juvenility. Instead of hoping that there'll be sufficient cutting material available from the cone of juvenility, there are a couple of methods we can use to overcome the loss of juvenility and promote the production of more cutting material. Firstly, we can use hedging techniques on our mother stock. This means that instead of letting stock plants grow to maturity, we keep pruning them on a regular basis. This has the dual advantage of both maintaining juvenility and forcing production of more cutting material. In the photo on the right here, you can see a hedge of buckeye at a nursery in the Netherlands. This buckeye is usually a tree, but it's being maintained here as a low-growing hedge, so that the nursery has plenty of propagation material to work with, and so that the plant is kept in a juvenile state to make the rooting of cuttings much easier. We can also use a technique referred to as serial cutting. With this, we usually start out with a shrub or tree that's in its mature phase. We take some cuttings, hopefully some of them root. Once they're grown on and big enough, we take cuttings from them, root them, grow them on, then take cuttings from these plants, and so on. This whole process is referred to as serial cutting, and in each generation there's a slight reversion towards juvenility. This technique is good from both an ornamental and propagation point of view, because the wood doesn't lose its ability to bloom, but does become progressively easier to root. It does, of course, though, take a long time to do this, to go through that serial cutting process. The time of year can also affect the production of adventitious roots. For example, conifers tend to root best in fall or early spring. The Chinese fringe tree, Chionanthus retusus, has a really narrow window of opportunity in early June, and that seems to be the only time of year when cuttings from this tree will root. This seasonal aspect to rooting may be related to competition for carbohydrates and growth substances by developing shoots, or by developing flowers or fruits. It may also be related to seasonal variations in endogenous auxins and cytokinin levels, and the ratio between these two growth hormones. A seasonal lowering of endogenous auxins can often be overcome by us applying exogenous auxins at the base of a cutting or as a foliar feed. Flowering can also suppress adventitious root formation. We can overcome this by removing any flower buds when we're preparing cuttings, but this can be time-consuming and laborious. Again, using hedging techniques on our stock plants can encourage production of vegetative shoots without flower buds that we can then use for cuttings, sometimes at most times of the year. Alternatively, we can schedule cuttings to be taken after blooming has finished for the season. Some of our California native Ceanothus species are a good example of shrubs that often root better after blooming has finished for the season. Photoperiod can also have an effect on adventitious root formation. Photoperiod refers to the day length, or more accurately, the length of the night, as far as plants are concerned. The effect of photoperiod differs between species, but photoperiods that induce flowering can be inhibitory to adventitious root formation in some species. There are other techniques that we can use too to promote adventitious root formation. These include etiolation, blanching, exposure to high temperatures, and treatment with growth regulators. And I'm going to put more information on etiolation and blanching in Canvas for those of you who'd like to know a little more about this process. As I mentioned earlier, all of these techniques remain based on empirical evidence, and sometimes we need to combine some of these techniques in order to get our cuttings to root. Let's finish now by summarizing, as we always do, the material covered in this unit. Some harder to root woody plants don't produce adventitious roots when cuttings are treated with exogenous auxins and provided with appropriate environmental conditions, and we may need to try out additional techniques. Additional factors to consider for harder to root woody species include juvenility, seasonality, and photoperiod. And additional modified techniques that we can try out include additional wounding, including a section of older wood at the base of the cutting, etiolation, and blanching. And sometimes we need to try a combination of all of these techniques. Additional wounding at the base of the stem may expose more surface area that can absorb exogenous auxins. Additional wounding may also separate the layer of tough fibrous sclerenchyma cells that are present in some species that can block the emergence of adventitious roots through the epidermis. Additional cutting techniques that we can use include leaving a section of older wood at the base of the cutting as a heel or a mallet. For some species, prior to taking cuttings, treatments such as etiolation or blanching may also be helpful. The loss of juvenility can have an adverse effect on the production of adventitious roots. So techniques such as hedging can be useful in maintaining stock plants, and choosing wood from the zone of, or rather the cone of juvenility may also be useful. Other factors to consider include the effects of seasonality on rooting, and there may be a specific time of year when adventitious roots are produced. That's the end of this module on stem cuttings, and in the next module we're going to be talking about leaf and leaf bud cuttings.